Hello, everybody. We are here finally. I'm so sorry for this ridiculous delay, as usual. And this is becoming my modus operandi to have this some sort of idiotic, technological problems on the way to having an absolutely excellent conversation. So I'm just going to call, demonic intervention every single time. That's just going to be my line. All right. I am very happy to introduce to you all my cousin, who is now green. Lisa Kotar, who is an absolute expert in resilience. Oh, I should say that I'm doing this not on behalf of myself. I'm doing this officially as a member of Artifact Institute. So those of you who came to Louisville will already know what this is about. But we are especially interested today to talk about how culture plays a role in our in the models that we build for resistance, for ourselves, and for our communities. And I really want to talk with Lisa, especially about how she thinks we are, whether we are succeeding as a culture or failing right now to deal with this very interesting and odd, unheard of conflict of COVID-19. Anyway, Lisa, welcome. It's good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So tell us a little bit something about yourself. Who are you and why should we care?
I am your cousin, so you should care because of that. So right now I'm living in Moscow, Russia, but I am a lot of different things, I guess. So I'm an English teacher. I'm teaching English in Russia.
And that was Russia, from Russia.
Recreational therapy, which a lot of people always ask me what that is, because it's not like a therapist that works on people's leisure time, making it more productive and improves like their well-being. So there's a lot of elements kind of like a creator of culture, because you do have to work with people and the time that
we're having a bit of trouble with internet right now. I'm going to see if some of the problems are on my side or not.
Because I have found it to be, and I'm sure we'll get into this as the internet.
Lisa, we're going to have to do that all from the beginning because you actually cut out completely. And, I think,
cut out completely?
Yeah, you cut out completely, and you kept on coming in at such interesting and choice phrases, such as culture creation, and then something to do with technology and things like this. And, ladies and gentlemen, I have excellent news. Lisa, I'm sorry. This is far more important than everything else. My son has lost a tooth. Now we may carry on.
Is it the first one?
Not the silver. This is his third. And now he's going to lisp like a cutie pie. This is fantastic. All right, a good time to be resilient. All right, let's try that again. This may have been an issue on my side because somebody was streaming after I told them not to. We have a very full house of people.
Yeah.
Lisa,
yeah,
it's so good to have you. Let's do this again. Tell us who you are.
Okay, I am Lisa. I am your cousin. In case you're wondering, I am currently doing several things. I am in Moscow, Russia. I am teaching English for all kinds of ages. So I'm teaching anywhere from 3 years old to university. So I teach at a university. I teach psychology in English. So it's basically getting people more familiar with psychological terms, because psychology is a Western American thing more than it is Russian, but Russians would argue that as well. So we can get into that as later. I'm also researching resilience because it's something I researched in my graduate program where I studied recreational therapy. Which is something probably you haven't heard of. And if you have, that's really cool, because that's part of what I try to do is get people interested in recreational therapy. But it's basically being, recreational therapy has a lot of different elements, but it's applied psychology. So you're working with people on with their leisure time. So the time in which you would create culture is the time that you're using to rehabilitate somebody. So often, so an example of something you might do is work at a prison with people that have less than productive leisure habits and rehabilitate them through what they love doing. So there's a lot of resilience building in those moments. And so, yeah, that gives you a basic outline.
Excellent. So there's a lot in there that I'd like to unpack, especially since you're purposely putting in the word culture creation in there. But let's talk a little bit about. So I'm assuming you haven't yet worked with in prisons and things like this, right?
No, the most extreme population I've worked with. I mean, I volunteered with orphans, and then I worked in assisted living with like dementia and like hospice care. So that's been the most extreme. But yeah.
And so, what kind of things do you do with them to, I guess, make their leisure time? How would you describe it? So you take their leisure time, and what do you do with it?
So yeah, it depends on the population that you're working with. So if you're working
with dementia, let's take.
Yeah. So with hospice care and dementia, it can depend on the client, but you are working with people on a lot of assisting them on like end of life processing. So that resilience, I guess, in life traumas or their life events in a way that makes them understand them and find meaning in them. But in terms of like working with their leisure time, it can be anything from like very sensory, just like looking through old pictures and pointing to their old pictures and reliving memories that way if they've already lost their like verbal, their abilities, their basic like functional abilities, like sensory functioning. But if they're able to talk more, then you work with them on their actual hobbies. So sometimes it might be something art. I had a client that was a pretty well-known writer and journalist in New York City. And he was probably one of my most interesting clients because he spent a lot of his time as a young person working and had to process a lot of his overworked life at the end of his life and kind of finding in the moments that we're not at work. So.
That's really interesting. Okay, so that's that's fantastic because
hey there.
I think that yeah, I'm there. Can you hear me? You're still streaming, so let's just hope that this catches up a little bit. So this old man that you're talking about, who's overworking in his youth, and now had to process that. I think that's really interesting. I want to talk a little bit about that because I see that one of the reactions for myself, certainly, and for others, is that to this crisis and to being at home for extended periods of time, to having to deal with a lot of an overload of information, a lot of which is based on emotion, not on hard fact. A lot of people are finding their release in overwork. So can you tell us a little bit about how your client, if it's not too much of a client patient privilege thing, how he saw his overwork in his youth and whether or not he found it to be ultimately worth it, or did he perhaps wish that he did things otherwise? And we're stuck again. This is lovely. Internet in Russia, everybody. Hurrah.
So I got part of this question and
all right.
I caught part of your question, but you cut out a lot. Okay. And now I can hear you, but I can't see your mouth moving at the same time.
This seems to be a general issue. Настенька, ты, пожалуйста, перепроверь, что там никто не смотрел на интернет, ничего не делал. Хорошо. It might be partially on your side as well, Lisa. I think this might be just a connectivity issue. Let's try again. So
I'm going to move location.
Okay. So let's try this again. The question about this old man who was processing his youth and how he was overworked a lot during his youth. I find that to be really interesting. I find that to be really interesting perspective to look at the idea of using your leisure time wisely right now, especially because I don't know how about you, but for me and for a lot of people I see around, one of the reactions to the absolute overload of information that people are getting right now from the news and from their family, from other sources, is that they're plunging themselves into overwork to try to deal with this crisis instead of being open to being with their friends or with their family, or being kind of more present or not freaking out in some way. So what I wanted to ask was, did this man, if it's okay for you to tell us, you don't have to give names or anything, but how did he ultimately come to terms with the overwork of his youth? Did he regret it? Or did he eventually come to terms with it and find that it was a good way of dealing with his reality?
Yeah, so he did regret the time he spent at work. And on the one hand, he did definitely value the status that he gained because of it and the like prestige. He said that the only thing that mattered in the end was his daughter and his relationship with his daughter. His things with his wife were not so good as a result of work. But I think that the parent-child bond is kind of like, regardless of how you develop it, parents will always love their children, right? So the other part of your question was more like how people are dealing with this in terms of the virus. And I think it's definitely a wake-up call for a lot of people and for myself as well, because I think it's more often promoted to have too much going on than to have some period of time when you don't have something going on. So I think that a lot of people are being thrown into a panic and trying to fill up those hours that they would have been either commuting, in a meeting, like in person, go walking to a meeting. But I think it's also a really good wake-up call that makes people slow down and savor moments that they wouldn't have been able to savor before. So something like a concept that we talked about a lot in my education was teaching people how to do something very simple like savoring. So you would literally walk through people on remembering positive moments in their lives and describing them in detail, because when you're constantly rushing through those moments, you don't embrace them as much. But then even on like a biological level, you don't change. It's reflected in your like brain chemistry. If you're not present in the moment, if you're not there, you actually don't change on like a physical level. You don't change towards being like more healthy. So I would say that it's a really important time for people to slow down, and not everybody has the luxury. It's a very difficult time for a lot of people, right? And not like everybody can be with family, or they shouldn't be with family because it could be a risk. But it could be a time then that they might need to be alone, and that's okay, and not scary, but it's okay.
Yeah, well, the scariness of being alone is a topic that we'll touch on because it's a big one. But I think before we get any further, because there's a lot of really good stuff here, but I want to get really specific and try to define for myself first of all, but probably for other people who are listening, what exactly do we mean by resilience? Not in the general term, not in the general dictionary term, but specifically in the psychological way.
Yeah. So what do we mean, or what do I mean?
I mean, what does the technical term resilience actually mean?
Resilience, I think, its most basic level is to rebound from stress or trauma to the same level of functioning that you were at before. I like to take it a step further, and I think that this is the trend more now, is that people are realizing that resilience isn't just rebounding to the same level of stress and trauma, or its same level of functioning, but it's actually transforming that situation and making something out of it. So it's taking kind of the dirt and sowing seeds and growing something out of the dirt, right? So that's what I would say is the ideal definition of resilience.
And in terms of your studies and in terms of your work, how do you go about, practically speaking, helping somebody who has come through a traumatic experience, generally speaking, to try to help them be more resilient? We'll get more specific later, but let's talk generalities first. So what are some sort of general principles about how to improve or how do you help somebody become resilient?
I think that first and foremost with resilience, it depends on, I guess, the state of where they are in the trauma. Because at some point in the very beginning, it might just be listening, and then kind of hearing where you might need to develop certain levels of resilience. And then I think there's several things. There's resilience requires both an understanding of like structure and routine, that I think building like habits in your life that will make you more resilient and live a more like a higher functioning life, and not like more interesting life. But it also requires like a development of flexibility, and that's kind of, and you see this on like all levels of resilience. It's not just and that's my interest is like in translating personal resilience into community and organizational resilience, and seeing the parallels. And you see it in organizations and communities as well. If you have too much, if you don't have any rigidity, you have chaos. And if you don't have enough flexibility, you're not able to adapt to like, situations like COVID, for example, which, yeah.
So let's talk personal resilience then. That balance between the rigidity and flexibility. So how do you manage to, what are some practical tips that people might take away from this? How could you navigate those difficult waters? Because there's a lot of productivity people who focus their entire sort of systems on your ability to properly structure your workday. But I find for myself, and I'm sure this is true for a lot of other people, that if all of my energy is put into making the ideal habit or the ideal week or the ideal workday, for myself, who is anyway somebody who has tons of different interests and who tend to work on energy as opposed to structured time, and I have kids and they're all at home all the time now, what ends up happening to me sometimes is that if I don't hit some of my objectives early on in the day, I will revert to stupid behaviors like scrolling through Facebook over and over again, and then hours will pass at a time, and then by the end of the day I'll blame myself and say, boy, what a waste of a life. I had this great plan and nothing worked, and I'll blame myself, and then I'll also blame everybody else. By the way, the shaking camera effect is Daniel, and I'm going to remove him right now. So Lisa, how do you manage to avoid both of those extremes? Keep talking. I'll be right back.
All right. Well, I mean, I think that something that I talk about a lot in my resilience, I guess, advising, and things that I've seen in my research and things that I've also practiced in my own life is that life is a system of practice and theory. So basically what that means in like practical terms is like you have to try and try again. So in terms of resilience, I think it's like a resetting of attitude, and it is like learning your daily habits and your limits, but then also being very aware of where your limits are. So in terms of like resilience in these daily times, or in these new like times with coronavirus, I think that it really it makes a lot of people, I think, reflect on their personal limits and extremes. And whereas like you could have filled up, you could have just kept going because you had demands coming from other places. Now you kind of know where that personal perfectionism needs to end, and you need to let go and accept, I guess, what the reality is. And I think that that's kind of, something that drew me to resilience is, I think, one of the most important signs of mental health, and something that everybody tries to get clients and groups of people is to a place where you can accept the unknown. And for me, in like Orthodox terms, that just means faith. So I think in the end, that's kind of the answer is being in a place where you can accept the unknown, but keep trying towards excellence.
So what is the current sort of standard practice in terms of compassion towards the self, in terms of resilience, or kind of being hard on yourself? What is generally considered to be the better approach, or is it pretty dependent on personality?
Yeah, I think that different people respond to different standards. However, So one thing that drew me towards resilience was that I saw that it was a lot of psychological interventions and traits that people developed ended up hurting people more than they were helping people. And I felt that something like resilience was kind of like this buoy, like it could be in the water, it's steady, like it takes the storm, but it's always the same shape the way it is, right? But I've rethought a lot of my ideas of resilience, because a lot of people think of resilience as the steel wall, and actually, like in organizational resilience, they've talked about this, that the first idea of people thinking was like, I am the steel wall, and I will resist this. But you can actually be like a psychopath and be resilient in that sense. Because you can climb up, any corporate ladder and be very resilient in that sense, because you are not affected by your emotions. But I think that true resilience is I think like that Rudyard Kipling poem, If. It's like being in the storm, but not being weathered by it. So.
Yeah, good. So being in Russia, we'll talk about Russia's response to. We can talk about Russia's response to all this a little bit if we want to. I'm just curious, you being a watcher and just you as a person, or somebody who sits and watches and filters information and makes interesting deductions about life around you. You've always been like that, and so I wanted to get your sense of how do you think people are dealing with COVID generally in terms of resilience? Are people generally reacting in a resilient manner, or are people generally showing a lack of resilience?
I think people generally are pretty resilient, and there's definitely there's definitely some concern here, and always that depends on personality. But I think in general, there's a lot. I would say there's a lot more of that steel wall resilience, in the sense of like they adapt quickly, and there's not a huge issue, and there's not like they don't need to call a mental health professional. In fact, things. So it's interesting in America. My friends that are mental health professionals are in super high demand right now. In Russia, my friends that are mental health professionals are actually losing work, because people have this like survival mentality of like, you only need the essentials.
Right.
So the essentials, people here have lived through the 90s. They knew what it was like without food on the shelves, and they know crisis mode, and it's like a natural reaction.
Right.
So there definitely has been a big difference from what I've heard. And I was here throughout the whole development of coronavirus, so I didn't see it in person as much. But there's definitely been a difference in when I discuss with people like the developments. There's definitely a different attitude is here. And it's been really good for me, because it's kind of made me think about the differences in resilience. And I think that there's an externally focused resilience. And an internally focused resilience, and that's kind of like the major divide I see in America and Russia. And I think that Russians have a much more internally focused resilience, where they reflect really quickly inward and adapt and change and like kind of move back to like that level of functioning. Whereas America is like, if there's a crisis, you're going to call the system, and you have this feeling that you can affect the system, right? I'm going to call homeowners insurance. I'm going to call this person, and I can affect this outward system and like create resilience. And then I'm going to create a strategic plan and present it to my neighborhood and my community, and we're going to get over this. So those are the big differences that I see.
That's really interesting, because I would have thought the opposite would be true, because Russia, having gone through a system where the government and the society was doing everything for them, you would have thought that they would be the ones reverting to that sort of thing, and they're not. While in America, the spirit of self-sufficiency is supposed to be integral to the American character, the Daniel Boone frontiersmen who are able to deal with everything, both externally and internally, with all dangers, and leave us alone, and we can manage this by ourselves, and never mind our external structures, because they can't possibly handle everything that we're doing. They can't possibly handle all of this crisis, and yet everything seems to have flipped. And I wonder why that is, because it would seem, well, in the longer. I mean, Russia certainly has a lot longer history than America, and as Russians have gone through a lot more crises than Americans have had, and Russians tend to remember the crises a lot more viscerally than Americans do. But I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm just negatively sort of inclined towards all this, but I'm just astounded at at what level of freakout there seems to be happening here in America, where we're supposed to be the ones that are self-sufficient and able to sort of deal with these sorts of issues. I don't know. What do you think?
The fact that people, I do think that there is a difference in terms of feeling that you can make a change. I think that there's a positive side to that, like externally focused resilience, is that you can feel like you make a change. And so in America, people do feel more free that they can positively affect their surroundings. Whereas in Russia, because people are really used to being part of a system and having things more freely dictated, I guess. They I think feel very self-sufficient in their own personal lives, and I think that's the difference. Is like in America, you feel very comfortable, like I think, affecting change in the systems, but people have spent so much time kind of externally focused, like developing maybe more, I guess, like image conscious pursuits. Whereas like in America and in Russia, I feel that people in their personal lives are very resourceful because they kind of accepted that the system would dictate a lot of these things. That's part of kind of that's just kind of generally accepted. And then in my personal life, I will control like this little sphere to the best of my ability. And so like, and that's how I can control my own person. That's how I can control kind of like the little things in my life, like the daily like family routines and whatnot. So that's how I see it, because I thought about it as well. So there's definitely both are self-sufficient, but in different ways. And yeah, the level of freak out definitely is bigger. But also on the other hand, I mean, this is a little more political and psychological, but Russia reacted very quickly in the beginning and locked things down very quickly. And Russians also accept being locked down very quickly without complaint. Whereas in America, if you put like the level of lockdown that we have in Moscow right now, that would be a freak out in and of itself, because that's not part of American culture and politics. So
yeah, no, that's a good point. That's a really good point. So let's ask the big question: is the response to COVID-19, the way you see it, whether in Russia or in America, doesn't matter, is it a reflection on the fact that we have a strong culture? Now let's talk America specifically, from what you can tell. Or is it a reflection of the fact that we need to make a strong culture?
That is a big question. I would say I would lean like initially towards the fact that I think that we need to make a strong culture. I saw a post today, and I just think also a strong awareness of other, because I think that ironically everybody's being isolated, but the ironic thing is that I think that there's already an appreciation for the other that is developing, and you're seeing that on social media. You're seeing a lot of people, and this is the very like positive American influence the external world, is like they will go and volunteer, they will go do something, they will like change these outer systems because they feel that they can. And so I think that you can't be resilient by yourself. I think that resilience is only tested in the community. It's only tested in dialogue with somebody else. So I think that, yeah, in terms of your question on culture, I think that it's definitely going to be a big wake-up call, I think, in terms of our culture, because people are they have a lot less right now. And I think that you have to create a lot more when you have a lot less. So,
well, it seems to be a question more of not culture in general, but maybe a common culture. And maybe our parents' generation probably had something that you could call a common American culture, something that they could all agree on, that in the time of trouble in the Vietnam War, or whatever your political differences, you could probably get together around the fire and tell stories that most people would understand, or to have a conversation that would reference a common culture that everybody lived in. But now everything seems to be becoming more and more fragmented. And I guess what I wonder is if we're going to see something like a rash of suicides coming around as a result of all this.
I thought about that.
because alienation and loneliness is a reflection of a lack of common culture, and alienation and loneliness were already on the upswing, and this is just exacerbating it. So
Right.
I'm really curious to see. Curious is the wrong thing; it's a very clinical term. I'm worried that what we're going to see is we're going to see a lot of mental instability, a lot of suicides coming out as a result of this, especially if this doesn't go away very soon. So from where I'm sitting, from where I'm looking, the things that seem to be carrying people through is a strong sense of community, but more often than not, it's also a strong sense of community that has an existing culture in it, particularly communities of faith. I am really impressed with how a lot of traditional Catholics are coming together right now around this. And because the Catholic Church in general seems to be rather kind of all over the place. There's a lot of different movements within the church. The Catholic Church seems to be pushing it in a lot of directions. And here, it's like an opportunity for them to I'm really impressed with how they've all come together. And I'm not seeing it as much in the Orthodox community, which is a little bit distressing. But I guess that's not even a question. It's just me blabbing. So resilience in communities, how is it built? So how can, now knowing that we, in our small or large communities, whether we live in a city or whether we live in a countryside and have access only to a small group of families that we interact with, what are some practical things we can do now to build that resilience that will then perhaps help us in the long term?
That we can do right now?
Yeah.
There's two big elements that I've seen in my, I guess, readings, research, and discussions, and that's connection and resourcefulness. So I think if, like, resilience is like a branch word, right? And I mean, there's a lot of words that branch off from resilience, right? So there's like, resilience is optimism, it's connection, and it's resourcefulness, and it's a lot of other things. But in terms of community building, I think what I've found is that if individuals feel connected and they have a level of trust with their peers or with their community, and if they feel a certain awareness of resourcefulness. So I would say, like, in a crisis like this, it's understanding what you can do now, in terms of, like, what resources do you have to work from home? What resources do you have to, like, maintain your daily health? What resources do you have in terms of connection? Because people do have a lot. So they are able to FaceTime every day. They are able to, like, create kind of these, like, little realities in their homes that make it somewhat semi-normal and functional. But also, I mean, after that, what resources are you going to have? And, if you are going to be unemployed, and, like, how are you going to be connected now and in the long run? And I think that building communities will require kind of an awareness of both of those, like, what needs to happen. That's what resourcefulness also means, is, like, who needs what, and where can I get this? And that is something that I think, Americans and Russians both have this, but in very different ways.
So I've had several unpleasant experiences, not many, thank goodness. Most of the experiences I've had with other people have been profoundly moving, but there have been a few experiences of people who are reacting to this with a kind of hysteria that is completely outwardly focused. So rather than taking this as an opportunity to look inward and say, what can I do with myself to make the best of the situation? Or maybe, if we're going to go, really theological, how can I change myself to better effect change outside myself? Rather than do that, I've seen several people do the opposite and become kind of thought police to make sure that other people are completely following the rules that are going to save everybody completely. Like, if somebody happens to walk in within 3 feet of another person, they'll be the ones barking at them. Or on Facebook, they'll, if there's a beautiful photograph of a family walking through a largely, almost completely abandoned park, they'll be like, "You're not social distancing." Or, I had this profoundly unpleasant experience with one person after I wrote one of my blog posts on my blog, where I said that I made the point that this that even in the early stages, the projected mortality rate for this thing is not as high as some strains of the flu. And she responded with, "What do you mean? It's 14 times stronger than the flu." And I'm like, okay, that's not what I said. I said, some strains of the flu, like the really very
Yeah.
So how, since I think we're all interested in coming out of this, not merely as with our own resilience intact, but with our community resilience improved, what is the best way that on a personal level we can deal with people like that? Like, is it just best to ignore them, or do we want to try to change them? But is there a way that we can engage with them that might make things more productive? I don't know.
That is a tough question, because I think that we were having this issue before coronavirus, and we're very divided. And I think that the mentality of it's kind of like empathy for what you know versus empathy for this like big abstract thing, right? And that can manifest itself in a lot of different ways, I think, politically and psychologically and spiritually. But I think I'm going to give a pretty simple answer for this one, because I recently had a conversation, and the first thing that came to mind was in my program, we actually studied a lot of games, but we studied a lot of humor. And I think that if you're able to either make the other person laugh or be able to make a joke out of it, I think that's actually one of the most important ways of bonding with somebody that you disagree with. And if you are able to do it, it's, I think, a skill, and it's artful, and it can be difficult, especially if somebody is fired up. But I think that, for example, if in a political system you are able to like laugh at those who are in charge and joke about them, that's a healthy political system, right? If you're able to laugh at the other, that is like one of the ways to trust someone that you might not be friends with, but it's a level of trust that's really important that like keeps cohesion going in a community or in opposing communities even. So that's what I would say, is to find humor in it somehow, either for yourself or if you're able to with the other person, that would be ideal. I'm not saying like make fun of them and, know.
That's the thing. Humor for yourself is very easy to find in this situation.
Not in a way to start a war kind of thing. I don't know.
No, I know. And sometimes I just despair of it, because honestly, like it's as it is, things are tense, and to have people just go on these rampages, but it happens, and you have people actually. I mean, it's really striking to me how some Americans are starting to. And it's not many, thank goodness, but there's been a few cases that I know of for sure, people that I never would have expected that are actually calling the authorities on their neighbor, like being
really
being Soviet era stukachi. Like I cannot believe it. It's actually happening. Thank God it's a very small percentage, but there are some people who are so convinced that physical distancing is going to save everything that they're willing to stake their humanity even on some level on this. And that's, thank goodness there's not been that much of it, but certainly the appearance of it in a place like America, where you would have thought that the respect for the individual is supreme, it's kind of disturbing. And I find it in my darker moments a little bit hard to avoid globalizing this thing and thinking like this is going to end up all in a really bad place. Because it's
I mean, there's a lot of theories out there about why it's being handled this way. And
no, I mean, I'm not talking so much about the conspiracy theory stuff. I mean, there's plenty of that going on. I just remember 9/11. I remember 9/11 pretty and how everybody really, really came together, and it was a time of mourning for everyone. And even the subsequent Iraq War. I mean, there was a lot of division, but initially there was a lot of support for it. People were sort of together against the common enemy, and it would seem that here the enemy is quite clear, and it's not your neighbor. But it's just interesting because throughout history, it seems like people have had different responses to outbreaks of plague of this kind, and almost always there's been sort of extremes, right? You have the people that throw their neighbors out into the street to die. Then you have the people who go into strangers' homes to take care of them. But here, it seems like all extremes are off the table, and all you can possibly do is stay in one place and not do anything. And I wonder what kind of an effect that will have culturally speaking. Like, people keep talking about we're never going to be the same. So does that mean that our community is going to be affected in some sense, our sense of community? Are we not going to be able to communicate and have interactions with people like we used to? What do you think?
I mean, I'm an optimist, so I don't think so. I mean, will it be affected in terms of not being able to connect? I don't think so, because I actually see from my conversations and my observations, people are remembering what it is like to have community. And I think that this is actually really crucial to be happening at a time where I think that like the generation that's going through college, like the group of, like, I don't know if it's a generation, but people that are going, I'd say, through college right now, who grew up more individualistic than I did, and with like their own controlled little worlds on their phone more than I did. I think that they need to know more than anyone what it means to be in community and to be with other people. And I think that that was something that we were seeing as an issue with the church, and how are we going to teach this new generation that we need to be together? And I think that I mean, if we do it right, that could be what's already being done for us.
Sure, but how do we prevent them?
Yeah.
How do we prevent them, though, from going deeper into their own solipsistic realities? I mean, isn't the horror that we see around us just more reason to go into Netflix? Because all these things are now becoming free. You can have, watch brand new movies that have just come out for a much cheaper price. So what can we do then as a community to discourage that kind of retreat? Because it would seem to me that would be the more logical thing for them to do, for the most recent millennial generation. And it would seem to me like we're on the cusp of having a real bifurcation in the society, like where some people are going to go so far into their own little controlled worlds, and with the coming of 5G and augmented reality and virtual reality, that's just going to become more and more possible. So how do you make that bridge? Or is it enough that they see the people suffering around them? I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, my hope is that when things do clear up, people and I mean, people have already been discussing this, is that when this is done, I'm going to organize this and we're going to get together and see this. And I think if it's kind of like describing the faith or describing orthodoxy. I think if you use your words too much and try to prove something, then most often you probably won't prove anything. But if you're somehow able to get someone to experience what is the faith, that's the most important part, right? So I would say the same thing with connection, is that if you explain to somebody why connection is good, they might on some level have a memory that, okay, I remember that was nice once, but once you experience that again, so I would say being in positions or having ways of influence that bring those people into even just a day of connection. And I see it a lot with when I plan youth conferences and when I plan any kind of events. You always have that initial anxiety coming up to the event. Somebody wanted to be napping, somebody wanted to be this, but 9 times out of 10, when people leave an event, even if it's just a casual social event, even just seeing the other, just the general other human, they come out better than when they came in.
So you think that the shock itself might be enough to get them to reassess what they're doing and maybe try to reach out a little bit more, just because the abyss of the reality.
I think when they feel the contrast, that's what I'm saying, is that I think that afterwards people have to be going right into something that will give them connection, because I think only when you are taken out of because they're I think that a lot of people will have kind of built up habits and gotten into a little bit of a zombie mode by the time that they're done.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think but once they step into basically another reality, out of their virtual reality, will they have that perspective change and so feeling that. So I mean, that's up to everybody, right? That's up to people that can organize something, but that's up to families. That's up to, and that, because some people might not take that initiative themselves, but they will benefit from it, and some people will.
Well, maybe just the fact that we're all that our interdependence is now becoming so obvious that we have been fooled into thinking that we are individuals that can survive on our own. And this this tiny little microscopic thing has upended the societies of the entire world. So just to remind everybody that no, we are not independent at all, that everything that works around us is connected through vast networks to everything else. So maybe that's enough of a shock for people who would otherwise slip into that kind of closed off reality, or at least for their friends to recognize that, okay, we have to stop this now because we can't have this happen again.
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe. Tell me about your journal and why you're doing it.
The journaling challenge?
Yes.
The journaling challenge is to, increase engagement from the audience. And then also I've gotten some feedback, and I understand that resilience is a vague word. And I think that having basically 9 days to view it in different angles and just have 5 to 10 minutes of understanding the different aspects. So seeing, so today, for example, is resilient role models. So just finding somebody in your life that you think has overcome stress and trauma, somebody that you think rebounds, somebody that you look for, you look to as an example of strength, I would say, mental strength, spiritual strength. And so each day kind of builds upon the last, and hopefully gets people to find the value of resilience, but then also find how like multifaceted resilience is. And so they can kind of walk away with some more practical steps. And the journaling challenge kind of gets more practical as it goes on. It starts off like, what is the definition of resilience? So something more vague, just to get yourself acquainted and think about what you have understood it to be so far. And then by the end of it, you are kind of building your like post-COVID plan of resilience and what you'll be doing after that. So
tell people where to go, where they can find the prompts if they want to take advantage of this challenge.
Yes, I'm posting them day by day, and then at the end of the 9th day, I will post all of them, and people can see them all and partake in it whenever they want. You can do the challenge in a day, but they're in order to get people to look every day, we're gonna post once a day for the first 9 days, and then on the 9th day, I'll post all 10 prompts in a post.
What's the site?
So my website is learningresilience.org. You can find the prompts on the Instagram, actually, which is Instagram. The handle is Learning Resilience. So at Learning Resilience.
Okay.
And that's open. So even if you don't have Instagram, you can look at those. Or if you do, you can follow.
There you go. Practical advice on how to deal with this crisis. Seraphim, I have a few comments here. I want to make sure that I have no questions here. So far, it's just been people with a lot of really good input.
Yeah.
So those of you who are listening and not looking at the comments, go ahead and look at the comments, because in these kinds of sessions that I tend to have on my Patreon, the comments are almost as good as the conversation that's happening live. So, okay, cool. Always waiting for the next shoe to drop. Yeah. I certainly hope. I mean, it's being in the middle of nowhere and having access to a lot of information without having the opportunity to talk to people about it, or having an opportunity to talk to people that tend to look at the world very negatively, can be a bit of a burden for some people. So it's good to hear a positive outlook on all this, especially from Russia, which we are told by the New York Times is basically being run by a police state. I mean, every single day there's another article in the New York Times about how Russia is just devolving into this police state. And I'm looking outside, I'm like, there's no people outside here in Richfield Springs, USA. So why are you writing to me about Moscow? Like, look outside the window, for goodness sake. But yeah, anyway, Lisa, it's time for you to go to bed, and it's time for us to go and write our responses to today's journaling challenge. What is today's challenge? It's the resilient role
model. So define a role model, talk about their behaviors and experiences, and why you find them to be resilient.
Okay, well, I hope everybody takes part in this. I'm certainly going to do it. I have my recently purchased full focus journal, because I cannot have anything without plugging one of products, of course. So I'm going to do it. I hope you all do. And then maybe after the 9th day, we can all share what we came up with if you guys want. And in the meantime, that's enough for today. So Lisa, thank you so much for coming out. It's always a pleasure to talk to you officially and not. All right.